601, Chapter 601. It was early November, on the 5th to be exact, when the day-to-day activity in Nick's territory got shook up. Nick was out at the Adventurers Guild, with Hephaestus gathering data from Zampacuto users that had achieved Shikai to see how they could tweak the creation of Zampacuto to better serve their users. During this process, a frail-looking old man entered the guild and looked to be heading to the counter which was past Nick when Nick's danger senses went off. Pacha. A golden spear tip pierced through his chest, missing his heart, thanks to him moving out of the way just in time. But a fatal wound nonetheless, as poison surged from the wound as Zeus, who had been in disguise, fled the area. The flesh rotted rapidly in that location, but Nick remained calm, if rather irritated. I hadn't expected to lose this body like this at all. So much work to explain why I am not dead after this. He, though, as the body started to die. Relinquishing control over the body, Nick briefly floated everywhere in his realm before his full conscious entered his second body. The air shimmered, and in an instant Nick stood next to his own corpse in the guild hall. "Nick, is that you?" Sirius asked, with a confused look at Nick, who was clearly not human. "It is. This is just another body of mine." I admit that I had not anticipated Zeus assassinating my original body in such a manner. I apologize for this sudden reveal, but as you can tell, I was not left with much choice. Nick said calmly, while everyone nearby, surprisingly, didn't look uncomfortable with his current form, but rather relieved that he wasn't dead. "You all seem unbothered by my form. Why?" he asked, after seeing this, as it confused him. "No offense, Nick, but people were actually betting on whether or not you were even human for a while now. Don't get me wrong, your form, as you call it, is rather off-putting, but not really hard to accept," Sirius said with a shrug. Nick was surprised by this answer, as he had thought his secret of not being human was fairly well kept. "What made people question my race anyways?" Nick asked curiously. "It was a bunch of stuff, really, your eyes. The weird affinity for crafting you have, your power, age, and skill. A bunch of stuff, but the really big one was that God's awful presence of yours. It honestly feels like you are 2 seconds away from killing and eating everyone here at any given moment. No offense," Sirius said honestly. Thinking back on it, Nick found it rather foolish of him to not have considered the sort of presence and aura he would have as whatever he was now. Elves were otherworldly feeling, celestial birds were beastly proud creatures of power, Daedra were primal beings of chaos and power, and hollows were not much different, except rather than power they were all about hunger instead. All that considered, and it was pretty clear that his presence would probably make people nervous, even if he wasn't tier 5. "I am sorry if I have made any of you uncomfortable. It was not my intention," Nick said honestly, and most of the people here just waved it off. It wasn't easy to bother them, since as adventurers, they regularly encountered strange or crazy things out in the wild. Still, I think we all want to know what with the dead body on the floor and all that, but were you ever human? One of the adventurers asked curiously. "I suppose. I have no need to hide it any more, but yes, I was a few years ago. I first started my change away from humanity in my first year at Hogwarts, in fact. What I am now is actually a fairly recent change, at only a year and a half roughly since I became like this," Nick explained honestly. "How's this body here work then? Are you some sort of hive mind or something?" A muggle hunter asked worriedly as he pointed at the corpse on the floor. Nick chuckled. "Not at all. Both this body and that one are truly mine and never belong to anyone else. It's hard to explain, but I can assure you that I am only one mind rather than a network of minds like you are worried about. Speaking of, I really should take that so I can recycle it and put it back to use. This form isn't exactly inconspicuous, as you can clearly tell," Nick said as he waved his hand, sending his dead body into the realm to get recycled. 602, Chapter 602. Nick didn't even bring his current body back into the realm as he started breaking down his original body into its base components. Normally, he would just be able to repair the damage and then kickstart the heart again to return life to the body. But thanks to Zeus's poison, that was impossible, as all the blood and flesh of the body had been necrotized. You can't heal dead cells, so the entire body had to be scrapped to remove the poison before he had to rebuild the entire thing. It wasn't hard, as Nick knew every single detail of his original body on a cellular level and just had to put the base components together in the correct order. For a Daedric realm, Lord familiar with the body being made, this was little more than child's play. Within 15 minutes, Nick had a new body that was almost the exact same as his previous one. The biggest difference was that this body, while human or elvish in appearance, was still very much Daedric. Still, once Nick took control of it and swapped it with his Daedric form in the real world, no one could tell the difference from before, so it did its job. "Done this sort of thing before, I take it?" Sirius asked, while checking out the new body. "Only once before, when creating the form I was just using. It's actually quite easy once you figure out the basics," Nick said casually. It was at this point in time that Hephaestus returned from her chase after Zeus with a frustrated expression. Nick wasn't surprised that she hadn't caught him, as it was clear that Zeus's lightning domain focused on speed and power primarily, and lightning was one of the fastest things on Earth. As a result, it made it very difficult for one to try and catch Zeus without a similarly fast domain. One would think that teleporting and speed were hand in hand, but in fact that wasn't actually true, as space was all about stability and stagnation. This meant that when teleporting or manipulating space at all, there is always a noticeable delay when it was used. During that delay, a truly fast enemy like Zeus would spot and evade the teleportation, which made the whole point of it moot unless you knew where they were heading. You need not fret over your lack of success catching him. Since he has made the first move, it is only fair I return the favor now," Nick said with a smirk which cheered her up. "What do you have in mind?" she asked curiously. Nick's revenge was simple, and at the same time effective to behold. Zeus destroyed one of his bodies, so Nick thought it only fair he take something the god held dear. Simply put, Nick was going to steal the master bolt from Zeus. That was the weapon that Zeus had wielded to pierce through his body and had possessed for a great deal of his life. To say that Zeus was attached to the weapon would be a grave understatement, as the weapon was so tightly connected to the god that Nick was certain it was actually a part of his domains at this point. Depriving Zeus of this weapon would be a massive blow to his power, and may even make his foundation unstable from having one of its pillars ripped away. The few spies who hadn't been noticed yet had revealed all of Zeus's habits, and the god was sloppy and careless in his own empire. Clearly, he didn't think anyone would have the guts to attack him in his territory, and as a result tended to leave his weapon unprotected when he entertained his harem. Nick chose to seal away all his power and sneak into the palace of the god while he was busy, and snatched the weapon into his realm before vanishing from the palace in the instant the god had been alarmed. The weapon resisted and rampaged in the realm to try and heed its master's call, but Nick had the realm slowly weaken and break it down to be absorbed. So I was right. The weapon did hold a part of his domain. Nick thought with a grin as the mana in his realm surged to hyper-dense levels as the power of the weapon was assimilated into it. Even better, Nick was able to, for a few days at least, gain insight into the lightning domain that had been attached to the weapon, which was an unexpected but welcome profit. Zeus himself, however, was not doing so hot, as a part of his power's foundation had been forcefully ripped from him and destroyed, which set his power back to the point he was now fearful of Hephaestus coming to kill him, as he was weaker than before while she was even more powerful. 603, Chapter 603. Zeus Pav, as much as I hate to admit it, I was wrong. In my hubris, I had thought that the man that my daughter had attached herself to was merely just a talented mortal. I have watched my daughter for millennium, so I know better than any that she lacked the ability to create these strange crafting methods that her territory is filled with items from. These Zampacuto in particular are of great concern, as with them every mortal in her territory is now more dangerous than most trained mortals in my army. I had believed that the man my daughter attached herself to was merely a grand talent in crafting and had greatly improved her power with his own knowledge. I believed that if I were to kill this mortal, she would stop growing. I was wrong. Oh, was I wrong? The man had fooled the entire world into believing the body he appeared as to be his true form, and even I was fooled into thinking I had succeeded in killing him with a sneak attack. As it turned out, however, the bastard had been barely inconvenienced by my actions. It was shameful for me, and I hated him for it. I had thought to indulge myself in my harem to ease my frustration, but I could never have expected what happened next. My precious companion, the master bolt, had been stolen from me and destroyed, taking a large chunk of my power with it. For the first time since I fought my father and the other titans, I felt true fear. Not the petty concerns of being deposed or defied, but the understanding that I was in serious danger. I was forced into hiding as my daughter came to hunt me down like a wounded deer. It was humiliating, and I wanted nothing more than to teach her where she belonged, under my foot. But I had to bide my time until I recovered and grew more powerful, so I sent her one last glare before vanishing in the sea of mortals. I found a spot outside of her perception to live in the meanwhile, a cave below the frozen landscape of the southern part of the world. There I hid and focused all my time and energy on repairing the damage the destruction of my weapon had caused. 2 years later, normal path. 2 years had come and gone since Nick destroyed the Master Bolt, and Hephaestus scared Zeus into hiding like a coward. The world had changed greatly in this time, as Zampercutos had made their way into every nation and profession. Civilization had more or less reached the same point as it had before the mana surge in terms of stability. At the forefront of this recovery and advancement was Nick and Hephaestus. Together, they had made many powerful items that raised the quality of life for the people in their territory so high that it was hard for other nations to keep their people from trying to go there. Sports had been revived in that place. The city was a massive magical marvel, as the entire thing had been enchanted. Personal achievement had never been higher, and there were 2 guards residing there. Yes, Nick had reached Tier 7 in the last 2 years, though there was a problem neither he or Hephaestus had anticipated. While he was technically Tier 7, his power was only Tier 6, as he simply lacked the mana to fully exert his Tier 7 power. This was no small sum to make up either. While the realm had grown many times larger, and now had a surface area similar to a medium-sized state from pre-ritual America, his mana was nowhere near the same as a standard Tier 7. Despite this, however, he was a bona fide guard now, and that came with quite a few perks. First and most important in his opinion was that his mind now worked at unbelievably fast speeds that exceeded even Hephaestus's. This was to be expected, considering what his domains were, however, so neither of them cared all that much. The second perk was that Nick could quite literally see the domains that made up the world, as his mana senses had evolved after reaching Tier 7. According to Hephaestus, the guards who held the magic domain usually had something similar, so it too was par for the course. The third perk, however, was an entirely unique thing for Nick, as he had become a Daedric Prince, a weak one granted, but one nonetheless. He was officially the Daedric Prince of Creation, Destruction, and Hunger. This wasn't mere titles, however, as they held real power and gave Nick access to those domains. In truth, the first 2 were from all of his original domains, fusing together upon reaching godhood, and the last from his hollow part. 604, Chapter 604. At first glance, one would think that all domains were equal, but like all things in the world, that simply isn't true. Some domains are simply more important on a reality scale, such as space and time. Many domains relied on these 2 in order to even exist after all. Creation and destruction were 2 domains that actually consisted of multiple other domains in a sort of overarching umbrella domain. Magic, souls, fire, weather, and lightning were all domains that fell under destruction, which barely qualified Nick to attain it upon his apotheosis. In the same vein, magic, souls, crafting, language, and weather were domains that fell under creation, which made Nick more in tune with this domain than the other. Nick's bird and hunger domains were the only 2 that simply didn't fit in his general domain scheme. One would think the hunger domain to fall under the destruction domain, but it was actually under the nature domain alongside the bird domain. Despite this, Nick's attainments in these 2 domains were shallow at best, as he had never bothered to spend any time on them, so he was unqualified to receive the nature domain as well. This transformation to a higher domain was actually an innate trait that all beings that weren't born guards have upon reaching divinity if they have multiple domains under a greater domain. The reason for this was because of the world itself balancing things out. Born guards were tier 7 right away, and as a result had no time at all to really build up mastery of their domains before ascending. Apotheosis was not a simple process, and upon achieving it all of one's mastery was judged, for lack of a better word, and rewarded by the world accordingly. Without any mastery of their domains, since they were born guards, they got no rewards, as in many ways, simply being born a guard was reward enough. Having higher domains didn't automatically mean that someone was more powerful than other guards, however. That simply wasn't how domains worked, but rather it was about potential instead. Regular domains only had so many possible ways to be mastered before they simply ran out of potential. A good example was the crafting domain that Nick and Hephaestus had. Even though the styles Nick introduced had major differences, they also had many similarities. This applied to every crafting style he might get in the future as well, which meant that at some point that domains simply won't grow any more regardless of the effort put into it. Fire and lightning were the same in how limited they were. Higher domains like creation and destruction, on the other hand, were far broader in terms of potential because they held the regular domains that fell under them, which was quite a long list. In other words, Nick wasn't more powerful than Hephaestus and Zeus, but he had more room for growth and power in the future. This was very bad news for Zeus, as it meant that he was now limited in time, as if he didn't manage to kill Nick before he can grow into this potential, it was game over for him. The problem came in the form of Nick being damn near impossible to kill thanks to being bound to his realm. Speaking of the realm, Nick no longer needed to keep the ring that housed it on his person to freely access it. This meant he had been able to hide away the only weakness he had far from Zeus's perception. Unless Nick was stupid and brought the guard into the realm, he was effectively immortal in the truest sense of the word. Zeus didn't know this, though, and while he repaired and honed his power over the last 2 years, everyone else in the world wasn't idle either. No new guards besides Nick had appeared, but a few new tier 4s and 5s had shown up. There was even a couple tier 6s in the form of the Flammels that had become prominent. On the list of tier 4s was unsurprisingly Snape, who was only lacking in pure mana to reach that point previously. What was an unexpected addition to that list was Hagrid, whose giant blood had made him grow in pure power after the ritual had finished, and over this past 2 years had broken into tier 4 just based on his own knowledge and mastery of nature. Dumbledore had become tier 5 as well, but that was honestly to be expected. The biggest improvement, however, was Celebrimber, who had endured Nick's tough teaching and made great strides over the last 2 years. He had grown to tier 4, but had fallen in love with the subtleties of magic, and thus tended to obsess over the things he didn't know about it, rather than work on advancing his power. 605, Chapter 605. During the last 2 years, Nick had spent millions of points on new knowledge from the system and grown his library into a madness-inducingly large and complex thing. Of course, there was also a Dwemer lexicon version of the library, as well as he had finished digesting the lexicon he got years back. He now knew basically everything the Dwemer had thought to include within it. Amongst that knowledge was information on alchemically altering plant life, as well as various new farming informations from that world. Thanks to this, the food problem had been truly and completely solved in Nick's territory. Not to say he hadn't helped others with it either, but unlike his territory that could speed up the results via Zampercudos that were commonplace, the others would need at least another year to begin to see results. Nick had also chosen to purchase one of the power systems from another world to supplement his people's lack of power. To be more specific, he purchased the knowledge on it and spent a while to bring it into reality in this world. The reason for this was because Nick had noticed a rather glaring flaw with the Zampercudos' improvement of power in those wielding them. Time. It simply took too long for those wielding the things in safety to gain more power. This was the nature of the spiritual energy that the Zampercudo affected, as fast growth only came from danger. After achieving Shikai, there was a spike in power held by the person wielding the weapons, but after that it was agonizingly slow. To fix this, Nick chose a power system that didn't clash with magic or Zampercutos and still offered a fairly quick improvement, Nen. Not to be confused with the Elvish word for water, this system of power was basically the manipulation of one's own life force to create effects that were very similar to magic. Unlike magic, however, the rules for this system of power were downright crooked and seemingly made little to no sense. Basically, one using it first released their life force from their body in the form of aura, which is just raw energy at that point. After that comes harnessing the energy and controlling it. After that, one needs to determine what type of Nen they are compatible with, of which there are 6 types. Enhancement, that focuses on empowering one's physical body and all the aspects involved in that. Transmutation, that transforms one's energy to an element or property. Emission allows the user to detach their aura from their bodies, allowing for ranged energy attacks and abilities. Conjuration is all about creating objects outrun one's aura. Manipulation is about controlling others and objects using one's aura. Finally is the rarest form of Nen, specialization that has properties from all the others equally and can bypass their boundaries as a result. The way the type of Nen is figured out for each person is through a method known as water divination. The way water divination works is that a glass of water with a leaf floating on top of it is filled with one's aura, and the innate properties of the energy that person possesses changes something in the water or leaf. For enhancers, the water will increase from seemingly thin air. For transmuters, the taste of the water will change. For emitters, the water will change color. For conjurers, the water forms impurities in it like salt or metal or even dirt. For manipulators, the leaf floating at the top of the water will move without any outside force acting on it. Specialists, however, are categorized as such when something beyond each of the other identifiers happens to the water, which can vary from specialist to specialist. Regardless of which type of Nen one has, they can create abilities that use properties from other types, but should typically stick to the type they are naturally inclined towards. The abilities one creates are in theory only limited by type, imagination, and restrictions. Basically, one figures out what they want the ability to do, and then from there begin placing restrictions on it to determine its rough power, with the more limitations or the harsher they are, the more powerful the ability. For example, if you were an enhancer, you could create an ability that lets you increase your strength, stamina, and durability. But in exchange, you have to be performing a specific movement to activate it, or you can only use it for a certain amount of time, or even really harsh stuff, like taking time off your lifespan per use. Regardless, the final result is determined by one's imagination and the limits they place on themselves. There is a universal limit for all Nen users, however, that applies when they explain their ability, as this is a purposeful handicap, and as such empowers them temporarily. 606, Chapter 606. Nick and Hephaestus were the first to officially gain Nen abilities, with Nick unlocking it by his own effort, and Hephaestus getting it unlocked by Nick. As a guard with a massive life force, Nick accidentally knocked out everyone in the territory the moment he unlocked his, as it was uncontrolled and fully extended. He wasn't using it on anyone, though, so it merely brushed against them and sent them to sleep. It was a bit annoying, but Nick needed to go to the realm in order to fully grasp and control his body's aura. He was certain that it was supposed to be harder to master than that, but he managed it in less than a day, thanks to being able to calculate and quantify the energy using his Daedric powers. Nick found it rather funny how it was so easy for him to master, because he as a Daedra was innately sensitive to life force. Typically not a good thing, but in this case it worked out perfectly, as it helped him unlock and master the energy in a short period of time. Hephaestus took much longer, at about a week of non-stop meditation. After that, they tested their Nen affinities, and Hephaestus got transmutation. Nick, on the other hand, got mixed results. His human body was a natural emitter, but his Daedric body was a specialist, as the water turned into steam under its aura. His true form couldn't even use Nen to begin with, since he didn't have a physical form technically. No Daedra did. The bodies they were seen as were merely containers to house their minds in most cases. Still, The difference in Nen types between his bodies was quite interesting to Nick, as it proved that the mind and soul truly had nothing to do with the power. That confirmation aside, it also presented a unique opportunity to him that he was rather interested to put into practice. For his human body, Nick created a single ability with a restriction that it was the only one he could have. He set a few conditions for the ability as well that made it entirely unusable with a single exception, his body's death. What the ability did was quite simple, really. It was a pure retaliation type ability. Upon his death, all of his aura and mana in his body would condense into a single spot, no bigger than a grain of sand, and shoot into the body of the one that killed him before detonating. This was a particularly vicious ability because it would only stop working after detonating within the body of whoever or whatever killed his body. This meant that escape was impossible regardless of speed or obstructions. Nick made this ability with Zeus in mind, as he was sure the other guard was nearing the point where he would come to attack again. Hephaestus hadn't stagnated over the last 2 years, but had slowed to a snail's pace on her improvements. For Nick's Diedrich body, however, he crafted a much different ability that was quite useful to him. Faithful Tithe was the ability he created, and the way it worked was that it allowed him to create a believer's mark, which was a small golden coin with an image of a hawk. The trick was that, when the coin was held by someone who believed in him, he gained a single counter. There was no limit to how many marks he could make either. Activating his ability allowed Nick to spend these counters in order to gain a one-time tithe of mana, which dissolved the marks. As far as restrictions went, Nick could only activate his tithe once a month, and only on the first. He also made it so his aura was reduced to a single percent as well for the rest of the month should he activate the ability. He could have made all sorts of other abilities, but this one was what he chose for the moment, as his lacking mana levels were severely holding him back. Hephaestus played around with her aura, but ended up settling for turning her aura into metal like mercury, and called it done. Nick couldn't blame her for her lack of interest in the power, as it simply didn't scale up to divine levels without so many restrictions that it may as well not be used at all. Even Nick's human body's ability had its death as a prerequisite just to be able to reach that level in theory. That's right, theory, because until it actually goes off, no one knew exactly how powerful it was going to be, only that it will be very powerful. Nick didn't expect it to kill Zeus or anything like that, but he was sure it would ruin the guard's day. 607, Chapter 607. Nick slowly began to unlock Nen in his citizens, but came across a slight snag that he needed to overcome. Nen relied on one's body quite heavily, and as a result, a prerequisite for unlocking it safely was to have a strong body, or at least an athletic one. Obviously, that was kind of a problem, as besides the adventurers and hunters that regularly trained, most people were fairly lazy in terms of exercise. Nick was helpless about this, as he couldn't exactly force people to regularly exercise. Well, he could, but it would just breed resentment. This unfortunately meant he had to be extra careful when unlocking people's Nen and stop the moment it looked like their bodies were rejecting the energy. This made the distribution of Nen rather slow, as none of those who got it unlocked could use it to unlock someone else's safely themselves. Training these new Nen users in how to control the energy also took time, and few of them managed to stop hemorrhaging aura when they slept in 2 months. This wasn't to say that there weren't exceptions to this. There were 3 people who were very talented in the energy. These 3 were members of the Adventurers Guild and regularly spent considerable amounts of time exploring the wilderness and fighting magical beasts. Amongst them, the slowest to grasp their Nen only took 2 weeks, and even then only because Nick insisted on collecting data that interfered with the learning process. Nen was a new path to power for Nick, and the system had very little on the topic that wasn't mere stories or historical records of what the energy had achieved. Apparently, the people of the world it came from never actually delved all that deeply in the how and why of the energy so much as the what. Specifically, what can they use it for, and what are its limits? It was frustrating to say the least, as it meant that Nick had no principles beyond the ones he already knew to understand the stuff better. Bothered by this, he spent quite a lot of time performing experiments and gathering data to make hypotheses on the inner working of the energy. In the rest of the world, while this was going on, one would be hard-pressed to find more than a small remnant of the way the world used to be before the ritual. Most technology had been broken down into raw materials again, including cars, power lines, power plants, high-end equipment, and much, much more. In quite a few ways, could be considered a whole new world, as many had come to appreciate the lack of technology once they got over their discomfort. The lack of light pollution meant that the vast array of stars overhead were visible every night, which still left many in awe even so long after the ritual had been completed. The integration of Muggle and Wizarding cultures was also a widespread trend in the world, and with the addition of Zampacuto and the other things that were getting traded out of the British Isles civilization, was unrecognizable at this point. Speaking of the Zampacutos, there had been a rather funny set of demands from the Japanese megacity. The fact that all the names of the Zampacuto were in Japanese had convinced that nation that Nick had stolen the creation method of the Zampacuto from one of their members. As a result, they demanded that he return it immediately and stop producing Zampacuto without delay. Nick had given them a big slap in the face, however, when he showed up in front of their leaders and spoke in over 20 different languages fluently, and asked if that meant he had stolen the rest of his methods from somewhere else in the world. After leaving, he sent the news all over the world, which forced the Japanese to rescind their demands in humiliation as the rest of the world mocked them. This might not have been the best move politically speaking, as he definitely angered the Japanese by so openly crushing their accusations, but frankly speaking, he didn't care. Why would he when he was a literal god, and his final ambition would set him as the owner of the entire world itself? Forget Japan, he wouldn't care about offending much more powerful places like France and Egypt that had tier 5s and 6s backing them. At this exact moment, there were only 3 beings on the entire planet who he was hesitant to offend needlessly: Hephaestus, Hestia, and Hades. Zeus would have been on that list if he wasn't going to be an enemy either way Nick acted. 608, Chapter 608. This wasn't to say that Nick went out of his way to offend every other country in the world, but he wasn't going to just roll over either. For many politicians, this made him quite an irritation, as all of his actions were clear-cut and dry. He actually used the taxes of those in his territory to improve the territory, and even went out of his way to lower the prices of items that were easy to obtain, while things like water and food were pretty much free. Compared to the selfish way that the vast majority of politicians governed, he was practically a saint, and it made them look very bad. The worst part for them, however, was that they all knew that they were powerless to take action against him. Embargoes, tariffs, or blockades, all useless as Nick made sure his territory was self-sufficient. Military action. What a joke. Almost the entire population of his territory was armed with a Zampacuto, and thus highly dangerous. Propaganda and slurring his reputation was also off the table, because quite frankly Nick couldn't care less. All the usual ways they would work to suppress someone they didn't like were nullified preemptively, which made them frustrated. One might ask, what about assassination? But by this point in time, the entire world knew how the last attempt at that had gone, and so it didn't even cross anyone's mind. There had been quite the amount of discord at the revelation that Nick wasn't human, or to be more specific, that he had discarded it willingly. A great many thought it a betrayal of his roots, but there were an equal amount that could understand why he did so as well. In this new world order, it had been made blatantly clear that other magical species were superior to humans innately. It was a heavy blow to humanity's pride, as the race that had for quite some time held absolute dominion over the world, to learn that they were innately worse than nearly every other race on the planet. Those that denied this reality and still thought that humanity was the superior race rejected Nick for discarding it. The rest turned thoughtful instead about whether or not they too should discard their humanity and become something greater. This served to split the world into 3 rough mindsets: the evolutionists, the traditionalists, and the neutrals who simply didn't care either way. This had caused a rise in deaths, unfortunately, as the three factions clashed, since their views didn't mix at all. There was a bit of a problem with the evolutionist faction, however, as many of them sought out ways to grow beyond their humanity. Both good and bad methods were considered. Some of the more skilled wizards of that faction succeeded in their endeavors, while others merely turned into monsters from incorrect calculations or ingredients. A good example was an Egyptian wizard who tried to mix aspects of various magical beasts into himself to undergo a qualitative transformation, only to end up as a mass of feral parts that attacked everything around it. It was gruesome and took a lot of power to put down, as the magical beasts combined resistances to magic and physical attacks gave the monster insane amounts of durability. Lupin had become a very popular choice for those seeking to become more than human, as his magic had settled after being held in place by the ring for so long. This meant that the man no longer needed the ring in order to be a perfect werewolf, and could even turn others into one as well. Most of those he had done so for were already werewolves, however, as he was trying his best to erase the curse entirely. Nick thought it a fool's errand, however, as many packs violently rejected the man, as they almost found the curse to be a sacred thing rather than a curse, and thus hated that he had corrupted it into what he did. Lupin was far too soft to kill these stubborn ones like he should, and as a result barely made a dent in the cursed werewolf population in the British Isles. The most irritating part, in Nick's opinion, was the evolutionists who sought him out for his method to go beyond the human race, as it was a tried and true method. Even after explaining that it was a series of fortunate events that couldn't be replicated, these people still didn't leave him alone, and even tried to ambush him to collect samples from him in hopes of reverse engineering the process for themselves. 609, Chapter 609. It took Nick a while, but he eventually managed to pass out a single believer's mark to every person in his territory. But finally, he was ready to activate his tithe. His aura flared out in a golden red hue from his body before shrinking drastically to exactly 1% of its original size. "Faithful tithe, collection," he shouted, and his ability activated. Immediately, the marks in the possession of those in his territory shattered, and just under 22 million streaks of rainbow light shot into the sky and flew towards Nick's island like a reverse meteor shower. These lights ignored the wards and directly slammed into Nick's chest like drops of water, and immediately he began to absorb and refine this mana, causing his stores to rapidly balloon. A single mark gave a minuscule amount of mana, like a drop of water, but 22 million marks was a flood. This was the beauty of this ability. It only showed its true value when used on a large group. Nick's mana stores rapidly grew to the halfway mark of Tier 6 by the time his first tithe ended. He had to grab the balcony railing to stabilize himself afterwards, however, as a sense of weakness overcame him, and he knew this was the backlash of using the ability. Nen was the life force of the body, so by effectively spending 99% of it on his ability, his body was drastically exhausted at the moment. He would recover in a few days after his body had time to adapt to the low level of energy it had in it at the moment. Is it wise to weaken your strongest form like this when Zeus could appear at any time? Hephaestus asked, concerned, as she let him lean on her for support. Not to worry. I am not strong enough to win against him at the moment anyways, so I don't intend to confront him with this form, but my other instead. Nick said reassuringly. I still don't like this plan of yours despite knowing that it won't actually be fatal to you, she said unhappily. Nick sighed. I would prefer not to do it either, but we need time for my power to grow, and this has the best shot of giving it to us, he said helplessly. Hephaestus herself had confirmed that while Zeus was sneaky when he was at a disadvantage, employing underhanded and despicable methods to shake up his opponents, he also was bold when he felt he was at an advantage. She had witnessed this during the period that the guards were fighting the Titans in. This meant that they would be given no time to accumulate power once Zeus felt confident in being able to overpower them. That was where Nick's human body's ability came in, as at the moment of its death, all his mana and aura would shoot into Zeus and explode. This definitely wouldn't be enough to kill Zeus, but it would be enough to make him cautious and unlikely to attack them openly again in case Nick could use the ability again. Nick couldn't, of course. Nobody could, as that was one of the restrictions Nick placed on the ability. It could only be used once ever. No one else could replicate it, even if they knew every detail about it due to this restriction. It was for this reason that Nick named the ability Taboo Calamity. While placing one's death as a prerequisite for an ability gave it a great increase in power, it wasn't enough to reach the level Nick wanted, so this restriction was added as well. This historical level limitation was so powerful that the ability crossed well into the divine as a result. In a related note, there was actually a person Nick had banned from learning Nen in fear of what they could accomplish with it, Hestia. The goddess held the sacrifice domain, and as a result was likely the most uniquely suited to creating abilities with the power. She knew instinctively how potent a restriction would be and could undoubtedly get very creative with her restrictions to create terrifying abilities. Nick outright banned her from Nen as a result, to the point he had locked all tomes and knowledge of it in his realm, where she had no hope of ever seeing it. Even further, those he unlocked the power in were sworn to secrecy and exclusivity via Diedrich contract, so they couldn't pass it to anyone else without permission. Anyways, Nick brought his now weakened body into the realm and switched over his focus to the human body as he waited for Zeus to pop up. 610, Chapter 610. It didn't really take all that long either, as Zeus approached early in the morning about 2 weeks later, and Nick and Hephaestus rushed out to meet him so that the battle didn't damage the territory. When they finally saw him, Nick was not particularly surprised to see that the guard was holding a Zampacuto. He had a pitying look at it, however, as the Zampacuto clearly didn't have a Shikai form, if the sense of pure rejection coming from the weapon was any indication. The weapon's spirit hated Zeus with a burning passion, and that was to be expected. "I assume you stole that from somewhere, correct?" Nick asked calmly. Zeus glared at him hatefully. "After your filthy hands destroyed my weapon, I needed a new one, and you foolishly sell them instead of keeping them to yourself," he said, particularly angry when mentioning the destroyed Master Bolt. "I pity that weapon to have a worthless owner like you." Nick said honestly, as he truly felt bad that his creation was in the hands of someone like Zeus, who could never use it to its full potential. To achieve Shikai, you needed a deep understanding and rapport with the spirit of the weapon, and Zeus was not the sort to treat a weapon as anything more than a tool or at best extension of his power. For someone like him, Shikai was impossible to achieve, and so the weapon would fail to ever reach its full potential in his hands. Oh, what a magnificent potential it was, as well as even at a mere glance Nick could see a vast amount of power being held by the weapon spirit that begged for release. "Your tongue is sharp, dog, but let's see if you can keep speaking like this after I rip it from your head." Zeus roared before coating his weapon in dense white lightning and swinging it horizontally at them. The slash was made with the full speed of lightning, so Hephaestus could barely react to it in time to block it with her hammer. Bang! The clash of forces shook the world around them as the space itself was warped and shredded. Nick held a hand over his face, and energy gathered at that point before turning into a bone-white mask with golden tiger stripes across the cheeks. Nick did this because it was the only way he could access his hollow powers while in his current form. His spiritual energy gathered on his hands, and he held them out at Zeus, sending a wide beam of energy at him. This was a zero, and Zeus briefly had a fearful expression as he dodged the attack. "Soul domain," he exclaimed with a horrified expression. "What's wrong, Zeus? Lose your nerve now that your life is in danger." Nick marked to capitalize on the guard's hubris. Zeus scowled. "I've been a guard longer than the human race has existed. Boy, don't think me foolish enough to fall for such a trap," he said disdainfully. "Worth a shot," Nick said with a shrug. "I was merely caught off guard by you having that loathsome domain. No doubt my daughter has told you of our particular weakness to it. I never would have guessed she would let someone so dangerous live. I am greatly disappointed," Zeus said, playing the father card. It was a dirty move, but also a poor one, as well as Hephaestus scoffed at the guard, as he clearly thought that approach would work. "I don't know what's worse, that you thought you were a good enough father to have that actually work, or that you didn't notice the spell formation I've been putting up around you this entire time." Nick marked as he sent mana into the Nen shape around Zeus. Nick's current body was an emitter, so obviously he could control and shape the energy away from his body without an ability. Thanks to this, he had started sending out Nen the moment he arrived, and had carefully been shaping it into a Daedric soul torture formation. As Zeus himself didn't have Nen, he couldn't see this happening, and as a result was caught unprepared when Nick surged out mana into the formation. The Daedric runes that were lifeless and inactive flared to life immediately, and Zeus screamed as the formation lashed out at his very soul, not to damage it, but to cause as much agony as possible. The guard didn't just sit there and take it, though, as his own power exploded out from him to disrupt the formation so he could escape. I do hope you've enjoyed that gift of mine. It was quite tricky to make after all, Nick said with a malicious gleam in his eyes. 611, Chapter 611. Zeus panted and leveled a baneful gaze at Nick, but before he could take a breather, Hephaestus came in with a heavy downswing of her hammer, forcing him to block. She wasn't as strong as him in terms of pure power, but her metal domain was nearly equal with his own lightning domain at this point, and thus set them roughly equal. Hephaestus had explained how divine combat and killing worked, and it was quite fascinating to Nick. Much like himself, a guard's physical form was merely a vessel for their soul, and destroying it only caused superficial damage to them. To truly harm a guard or kill them, you had to destroy their soul itself, which can be done in a few ways. The first was what Zeus and Hephaestus were doing, which was covering their attacks in their domains, as when a guard was hit by another's domain, it was a damaging thing for their soul. The second method was to directly attack their soul, which is what Nick's soul domain allowed, and why Zeus freaked out a bit when he was almost hit with the Zero. The final method was to effectively starve the guard to death by depleting the mana from the surroundings for an extended period of time. Guards exist in a pure energy state, so when the surrounding mana gets too low, their own energy begins to disperse to fill the void, which after a certain point means death, as their existence can't support itself anymore, and thus collapses in on itself. Anyways, Nick didn't just let Zeus and Hephaestus fight alone, and jumped in with a fire domain and spiritual energy, covered fist forcing Zeus on the absolute defensive. Nick couldn't stop the wide grin forming on his face as he jumped the guard with Hephaestus. Fine, I'll deal with you first, dog. Zeus roared and tanked Hephaestus's attack and stabbed at Nick with his lightning domain-covered blade. Nick didn't even bother dodging as he looked at the guard with a mocking expression as the blade created a massive hole in his chest. Hephaestus teleported away immediately, and Zeus looked confused for a moment before Nick's body imploded into a blinding point of light and shot towards him. The guard's instincts screamed at him to avoid this point of light, but no matter what he did, it hounded him relentlessly before eventually catching up to him and sinking into his chest. He was exhausted from burning his power to try and escape, and screamed in rage as he realized why Nick had a mocking expression before he died. Then it detonated. The entire world shook violently as a massive blast of pure destruction ripped out of Zeus and far into the distance around him. The blast wiped out everything in an area the size of the British Isles, leaving a massive molten crater behind. As Nick had expected, Zeus wasn't killed by this blast, but he had taken extremely serious damage and limped into hiding in his pure energy form. The rest of the world came to know what had transpired and effectively made a unanimous decision to not mess with Nick. There was now a British Isle-sized crater in the center of eastern Eurasia that stood as testament of how badly that could go for them. The Earth's own rotation and axis had been shifted from the explosion, which caused some lasting issues, as well such as the global temperature getting colder as they got a bit further away from the sun. Not wintry, since the shift had been minor, all things considered, but a good 10 degrees or so colder than before on average. For some in hot climate places, this was great, but for those in already slightly chilly or downright cold places, it got worse. Even though Nick was the one behind the blast, everyone blamed Zeus for it, because it wouldn't have happened if the guard had not come looking for trouble. It wasn't all bad, though, as Nick had managed to sneakily rescue the Zampacuto spirit before his ability activated thanks to the blade being in the middle of his chest. Tengoku no Seibanken, or Judge of Heaven, was the weapon's spirit's name, and it was so powerful that it took it a month to be reborn as a Daedra from the waters of the realm. Nick found it hilarious that Zeus of all people was the source of this spirit, as the spirit itself was all about balance, patience, and responsibility. Nick also learned something very useful from the spirit being reborn as a Daedra. The realm actually grows larger and more powerful the more powerful the Daedra bound to it were. He hadn't noticed that until now, as the highest any of them was tier 4, which was minuscule, but this spirit was innately tier 6, as it was born from the imprinting of a divine soul. 612, Chapter 612. The spirit being bound to the realm as a Daedra caused a very noticeable shift in the size of it, as the realm grew a good quarter larger. Tengoku's ability was frankly terrifying in Nick's opinion, and made him glad he rescued the spirit from Zeus. The ability was called Heaven's Judgment, and worked based on one's previous actions via the time domain. Nick wasn't sure if this was coincidence or a remnant of Kronos' influence on Zeus after his death, but regardless, the Zanpakuto turned Daedra had a stupidly broken domain. Space and time were two of the three domains that were all-encompassing, with the other domains falling beneath them. The third domain was reality, which contained everything all at once, including space and time. Anyways, Tengoku's ability covered the past aspect of time to a very small degree, as it was only focused on a single thing rather than all of time past. The ability went over one's entire life up to the point of present, and based on that passed a judgment that came in the form of a debuff, or if one was mostly good, a buff that increased or decreased one's power temporarily depending on what you got. The tricky part of the ability, however, was that one could actually choose whether or not some sins get ignored or judged. In other words, the ability was downright cracked and unfair, as besides infants and small children, there was no one alive without past sins. Surprisingly, Tengoku did not wish to become a god just yet, despite being able to with a small amount of effort. When asked why, it explained that it hoped to refine its domain before ascending, which Nick was all for. The reason Tengoku was being referred to as it rather than with a gender role was because the form the spirit had naturally was without gender, as it was a giant avian winged eye that had the face of a clock as its pupil and iris. Honestly speaking, it was almost Daedric in appearance despite having come from Zeus, and as a result, it fit the realm perfectly. Zeus had reconstituted himself within that month, but hadn't noticed the loss of his weapon's spirit, as he wasn't aware of it to begin with. Instead, he went about reclaiming his lost empire from 2 years ago, warily keeping an eye out for an attack that never came. He couldn't be blamed, as even after forming a new body, he had a brutal-looking scar across his chest from the damage he had taken from the explosion. The blast was created from pure mana, and Nen, which meant that even his soul had taken a good amount of damage from it. Like Nick and Hephaestus, thought the explosion had made the guard concerned about whether or not they had any more nasty surprises in stock to use against him. So Zeus didn't immediately go back after recovering from his injuries, but chose to bide his time. Nick knew that this peace was merely temporary, however, as once Zeus realized that he had to risk death to kill Nick before he grew into a true threat, they would be out of time. There would be no more back and forth at that point, but full-out non-stop battle until only one side was left standing. The first thing Nick needed to do, however, was reach a Tier 7's mana reserves. At this moment, he was a guard in name and form, but he lacked the raw power of one. That was ironically also the reason he was still stuck at the start of Tier 7, despite him expanding his understanding of his domains. The system was Nick's constant supply of new information, so naturally his understanding of his domains grew rapidly, but without reaching a guard's level of mana, his tier didn't rise even an inch. Hephaestus, on the other hand, was shooting upwards as she got tome after tome on metals, crafting, and fire. Both she and Nick were hoping that if she mastered those domains enough that she may be able to reach Tier 8 and possibly even get an evolution of her domains, like Nick himself had upon getting to Tier 7. They were hoping she could get creation, but would be fine with whatever so long as she got an upgrade of some sort. Nick himself was passing believers' marks out again, so that when the first of the month after next came, he could activate tithe again. He couldn't do it for the coming up first, though, as he needed at least a month to create and distribute the marks to everyone in his territory. 613. Chapter 613. One should keep in mind that Nick had close to 22 million people in his territory, so the fact he could even get a mark to all of them in a month's time was quite impressive. These were also Nen constructs, so nobody without Nen could even see them, which certainly didn't help matters. Still, Nick activated his tithe ability again and drew even closer to tier 7 levels of mana. The closer he got, the larger and more sturdy his realm grew as well. One might question why merely collecting mana like this even worked to increase his personal stores, and the answer was quite simple. It didn't. Well, to be more specific, his current issue was that despite being tier 7, he hadn't experienced having that amount of mana, so his stores could only recover passively what he had experienced. By forcefully adding more mana on top of this amount, his stores update to this new amount of mana, for a lack of better terminology. This only worked because he should have more mana than he does by virtue of merely being tier 7, but since he skipped tier 6 entirely, he never got that mana. In simple terms, Nick was playing catch-up as a result of him taking a shortcut previously that screwed him over a bit. Thanks to his Nen ability, though, he was making good progress on putting his mana stores where they should be. Add on the mana gathering array he had activated again, and he was constantly making strides forward. During this process, Nick worked to expand his realm via consuming entire uninhabited islands. He unfortunately had to break them down first, as directly adding them to the realm would mean trying to bind the entire world to himself, and wouldn't end well at all. Instead, Nick first detached the matter from the world, and then added it to his realm. No one was aware of this, however, as he was effectively eating away at the world to expand his power. This was obviously something that everyone would move to stop if they knew about. When it was mere truckloads of dirt and asteroids, no one would care, because those were things without any real significance, but entire islands was a whole other thing. This was like someone ripping out whole mountains from the planet, and there was only so many that existed. Still, this ravenous devouring of matter caused the realm's planet to explode in size, as over the next year it grew to the size of Australia in terms of surface area. Once it reached that size, Nick stopped consuming islands, as it was now impossible for Zeus to outright destroy the realm anymore. While it was still possible for him to destroy it, he couldn't do so in any amount of time that would prevent Nick from stopping him. The realm's size increase was coupled with Nick finally equalizing his mana stores with his tier 7 existence. The change was immediate once he did so, as his power immediately skyrocketed, and his entire island became a mana void, as every ounce of free-floating mana was sucked into him to fuel this ascension. Within mere moments, Nick's power went from the start of tier 7 to the upper reaches of it, as all his work on expanding his mastery of his domains caught up with him. Reaching out his hand, Nick lightly tapped the air with an extended finger, and the space he touched simply vanished, destroyed down to atoms in an instant, leaving only a void behind. That is rather concerning. Are you maintaining the void there, or is it simply unable to repair itself? Hephaestus asked, looking at the black nothingness where Nick was holding his finger. It is constantly trying to repair itself and get filled in, but my destruction domain is tearing apart everything that enters that area. At the same time, I can do the opposite as well, Nick said, and as if to prove his point, a diamond the size of a softball manifested in the void, yet still was surrounded by it at the same time. In the beginning, there was nothing, and then God said, "Let there be light," and so it was that there was light. Destruction, the absence of matter, and creation, the presence of it. I understand now, Nick said with a smile as he released his power, and the spot he pointed at immediately returned to normal with a slight difference. There was a diamond that wasn't there previously. Time, space, and reality are the foundation. Destruction and creation shape raw matter, and the rest of the domains give it function and substance. This is the secret of how the world functions. he said, understanding the subject perfectly. 614. Chapter 614. Did you not know this already? Hephaestus asked, confused. This was fundamental stuff for guards after all, and Nick should have known it. The theory, yes, but until now I couldn't really understand what that meant exactly. It was like I had all the pieces of a puzzle yet couldn't see the image they made until I finished putting them in place. Nick explained honestly. Just having the domains wasn't enough for Nick to fully grasp them, and until now he lacked the raw power necessary to fully utilize the domains as well. But after his power rose to its current level, that all changed, and now he had the full image, and it was surprisingly simple. One would think that the fundamental forces behind the world were complex and abstract, but at its most primal, the exact opposite was true. Time, space, reality, creation and destruction. These domains were the simple foundation of everything, and it was only when other domains were branched off of these that things got complex. Scientists have been looking at it wrong this whole time. Nick thought with a sigh. While I am happy that you have made progress, I cannot understand how this would aid us against Zeus. Hephaestus said, confused. It's simple, really. His own power is now ineffective against me. Any attack he makes can be dismantled by my destruction domain, as his own domains fall below it absolutely. Nick said with a smile. That smile vanished, however, a moment later when he felt his connection to Nazgul get cut off violently. Zeus! He roared in rage and murderous intent as he felt the guard's power come from the direction of where Nazgul was moments before. Nick's power rolled around him viciously as he tore space apart to arrive in front of Zeus. There he saw a charred and headless form with Zeus standing on top of it with a mocking smirk as he held a head whose eyes had lost their light and a bloody sword in his other hand. Nick's vision turned red, and he stopped caring about anything but ripping Zeus apart. His body split apart as his true form entered the world for the first time from his realm. It was far too heavy for the world to handle, however, as a void of pure destruction spread from him, and Zeus finally realized just how badly he messed up. Die! Nick's voice echoed through everywhere and nowhere at the same time, and the world around him obeyed his command and lost all sense of vitality. It was a wave of pure death, indiscriminate and dispassionate, that claimed everything it touched. Zeus tried to flee, to escape to safety, but he could not. There was no space to teleport through, no atmosphere to bypass with his speed. Nick had turned the surroundings into a pure void, and Zeus had never needed to travel through such a place before and was stuck. The guard tried to slash at Nick's true form with a blade covered in his domain, but the power and blade simply disintegrated alongside the hand, holding them soundlessly upon contact with Nick. For normal guards, their true soul state was their weakest for and had them vulnerable, but the exact opposite was true of Nick. His strongest form was his soul state, and only by using it could his full power come into play. It was a terrible thing, however, as in this state, and with his reason lost to wrath and grief, Nick carved a path of devastation as he lashed out at Zeus. The guard panicked fearfully and tried his best to stave off the coming reckoning, but even after figuring out how to escape the void, he couldn't flee Nick. He tried to get Hestia involved as well, but she merely watched on even as Nick's chase ravaged her lands. This wasn't to say she didn't want to stop him, but merely that she had sacrificed her ability to join any battle to her domain long ago, and as such could only lament the loss of life and consequences of Zeus's actions. In the end, Zeus fell under the relentless and ravenous wrath of Nick, as he simply couldn't flee fast enough to avoid injury, and these injuries eventually turned fatal for him. Death by 1,000 cuts in a way, as many small pieces of his soul were damaged, until that damage became too much for him to bear. In any other case, Zeus's death would be cause for celebration, but the sheer amount of devastation left in the wake turned this into a hollow victory. The Earth's landmasses had been reduced, but about 10% permanently, and nearly everyone in North America had been killed by Zeus going there in a foolish bid to get aid. 615. Chapter 615. With the source of his rage gone, Nick let the world reject him and return to his realm, but this rampage had cost him dearly. He fell into slumber as the damage he caused to himself, in his reckless use of everything, he had caused serious damage to himself. This damage was reflected in the realm as the planet was cracked and had large pieces floating about without any order or reason. This slumber was not a short one for Nick, and the world moved on without him as he recovered. Nobody forgot about him over the next decade, but many stopped looking for him as well after he seemingly just vanished from the earth. There were exceptions to this in the form of those closest to him, like Hephaestus, Dati, Celebrimber, and his friends. They knew that he was likely within his realm, but try as they might, none could enter it, even with the ring that housed it accessible to them, thanks to Hephaestus. There had been many that sought to punish Nick for the devastation his rampage had caused, but had been rebuffed by the goddess and those who supported Nick. It took a few years, but the world recovered and continued moving towards the future. No other place on Earth ever managed to reach the same height as Hephaestus's territory as she took control of it in Nick's absence. Not for lack of trying, but she refused to just stagnate in place, as she knew that would not be something Nick would have wanted to see. Things had changed greatly over this decade, however, as grand cities popped up, and there was even new guards born in the form of Nicholas Flamel and his wife. Even with Nick being absent, they maintained close ties to his territory, alongside Dumbledore, who was amongst those helping to crack a way into the realm. Nen had slowly become an aspect of life, as well with Zampercudos, and ironically enough had allowed people to begin colonizing the rest of the solar system. Through the use of Nen constructs and Zampercudo abilities, a great deal of the knowledge of the world's previous technology had been put to use once again, as well as advanced even further. Magic as a whole also flourished during this time, as many great leaps forward were made thanks to the full integration of muggles and wizards. The clash of understanding between the two sides led to many leaps forward in the places where this integration had occurred. The other places that treated muggles as little more than cattle or slaves fell behind and were eventually disbanded forcefully. The Order of the Golden Sands, for example, that had taken over Egypt and enslaved the muggles, there had been wiped out due to their stubbornness and refusal to change. Flamel himself had done this upon reaching Tier 7 and having had enough of the unneeded cruelty. It was a warm and peaceful day on June 1st of the 15th PR, post-ritual. This day seemed like all the others at first, but there was a huge difference. Nick woke up. Every Daedra connected to the realm felt it through their connection to the place, and they all gathered on the island that had been renamed the Throne, due to being Hephaestus living there. Ever since that fateful day, a decade prior, their connection to the realm had felt weak, almost ephemeral even. But the moment the realm fully fixed itself and Nick awoke from his lumber, it surged forth like a mighty river. Sure took his sweet time, didn't he? Ron joked with a smile. He had grown his hair out and wore a fine suit while holding a staff in his hand. He, like all the others, had grown up quite nicely, as he was healthy if pale from a lack of sunlight. He always did things at his own pace after all, Harry said with a smile of his own. He kept his hair short and wore a more traditional robe and had a toned build from his work as an adventurer. At his waist sat a sheathed blade and a holster that contained the Elder Wand. You guys think he's aged at all during this whole time? He's a guard, right? So doesn't that mean he doesn't age? Luna asked curiously. Guards age until our forms reach maturity. Hephaestus answered that question easily, without turning her gaze from the ring that held the realm. I don't think it makes much difference considering what his one form looked like a decade ago. He was nearly 8 feet tall after all. Hermione chimed in. She had her hair semi-long and wore a comfortable set of business robes. She had grown up fit and had pale skin from spending most of her time indoors since she went into politics after graduating. 616. Chapter 616. She was officially a part of Dumbledore's government and was doing well for herself there. Tracy and Daphne were like always there together and had grown into beauties in their own rights, though Tracy was more muscular than Daphne due to her metalworking. Dumbledore was also there, looking no older than 30, having a pleasant chat with Flamel and Vlad like the old friends they were. There were others who wanted to be here as well, but couldn't make it for whatever reasons, but this was a sudden thing, so it couldn't be helped. All conversations ceased when the air began to shimmer, and a moment later a man with long silver hair and golden eyes appeared in the room. I'm back. he said with a smile as he looked over the crowd. Took you long enough. Ron joked and everyone laughed. Went a bit overboard after Zeus killed Nazgul. Sorry about that. Nick said sheepishly. You must have forgotten that Nazgul's immortal like a phoenix. Daphne pointed out and Nick nodded. I felt our connection vanish and lost it. For the record, I hate vague prophecies, by the way, he said with a sigh. Trelawney did say you'd lose something you held most dear, didn't she? Thought she was just messing with you at the time. Joke's on us since she was right for the most part. Ran admitted honestly. Your skepticism was well warranted. A seer's visions are often a complicated thing to understand even in the best of circumstances. I would know after seeing many for centuries now. Flammel said with a chuckle. Annoying gift to have even for guards. Hephaestus added. From my senses, I was asleep for around 10 years or so. What did I miss? Nick asked, getting back on topic. Everyone told him all the things that had changed since that day, and if any of them made a mistake, one of the others corrected it. Dusk had left to explore the world, and no one knew where he was. Steve had died of heart attack in his sleep from being a fat, lazy niffler, and the Order of the Golden Sands had been eradicated. Funnily enough, Grindelwald had been found powerless and living as a muggle would in Brazil. He had been captured and executed, but even at the end, he had a smile on his face without any regret for what he did. In fact, he openly stated that he didn't regret doing it, only the cost it took to do it. Many thought he was referring to his powers being lost, but those truly aware held their tongues, not even trying to correct these thoughts. The man was perfectly content being painted as a self-centered monster, even with his last moments, and none of them could bring themselves to muddy the opinions of others with the truth. Sometimes, it was just easier letting the truth remain hidden for everyone involved. Nick congratulated everyone for their own pieces of news, such as Harry's wedding to Ginny or Flammel's ascension to Tier 7. The one he was most pleased with, however, was Hephaestus, who had reached Tier 8. The goddess herself put her foot down and made it clear that she wasn't taking no for an answer anymore. Nick no longer had the pressure of Zeus weighing himself down and agreed to marry her officially. His return wasn't met with only positivity, however, as many demanded that he pay for the destruction he caused before he fell asleep for a decade. His answer to this left many quite conflicted, as he simply solved a whole mass of problems that still existed all at once. Felt that it was never enough of a repayment, and that he should spend the rest of his life in penitence, but Nick refused. He may have been gone for a decade, but he was still easily the third or fourth most powerful being on the planet, so forcing the issue wasn't possible. It was on the day of his wedding, a massive event in and of itself, that a dark-haired man in a tattered black robe appeared in the center of the aisle. I would assume that as the uncle of the bride I am also invited to this event. The man spoke, and everyone suddenly realized the identity of the man, or rather God. So long as you aren't here to crash the wedding, then you are of course welcome to join the festivities, Nick said without any surprise on his face. In truth, he had been expecting the god of the underworld ever since he awoke from his slumber, so when he finally appeared, Nick was not taken off guard. 617. Chapter 617. Hades nodded calmly before taking a seat next to Nicholas Flamel, who looked very uncomfortable with the guard's presence. Nick couldn't blame him for it, though, as despite all records pointing out that Hades was fairly relaxed, he was still the god of the underworld, and in most ways the dead. People were naturally bothered by the concepts of these things, so having the god of them sitting next to you was likely very unnerving. Still, the wedding went on without any issue, and Nick and Hephaestus got married with Celebrimber as the officiator. The after-party was a wondrous affair, as Nick spared no expense to make it the best he could. The gift-giving as when things got a bit strange, as Hades presented his gift in a simple white box with lacy black ribbons tying it close. Within the box was a set of crowns, intricately made, and each holding a mysterious enchantment. As the ones who deposed the previous king of gods, and as the oldest remaining god, I present both of you the status of rulers of gods. These crowns will serve as your badge of office, even if they never touch either of your heads. Hades spoke, and there were gasps from those attending. Despite this, however, No one raised any objections to this, so Nick and Hephaestus donned their crowns. Hades bowed. "May your rule be prosperous and long," he said before slipping back into the crowd. The rest of the gifts were considerably more mundane, but still held great value and meaning to the couple. A few of Nick's friends got baby items as a joke, which made both Nick and Hephaestus embarrassed. Kids were undoubtedly going to happen, but not so soon, and not without careful planning. Nick was a Daedric prince after all, and any child of his was like as not going to take after their father in this regard. The world wasn't ready for that yet, and Nick wanted to fuse the entirety of Earth with his realm before he had any children to manage them better. After the wedding, the happy couple did as any newly wed couple does, and broke a bed. They had to specially craft a new one after that out of hyper-durable materials, since it was clear after they did the deed that no normal bed could withstand two guards going at it full tilt. Hades didn't go away after the wedding, but toured Nick's territory casually until after things went back to normal. There was no real honeymoon, as both Nick and Hephaestus enjoyed their work too much for that. At that time, the guard of the dead came to have a conversation that Nick had known would come for many years ahead of time. The actual content of the discussion, however, surprised Nick. "I have watched over this world for millennia, and in all that time, I have only ever witnessed a single other instance of someone like you appearing." He went by the name Solomon. He was like a sudden fog had crept up out of seemingly nowhere. In his time, he revolutionized magic and civilization as a whole, but unfortunately fell to age, as he felt immortality was a curse. Unlike him, however, you have embraced immortality, and as such fulfill the condition I have set. Hades spoke calmly and had a nostalgic look. "What condition?" Nick asked curiously. Being compared to a legendary sorcerer like Solomon was nice, and all but Nick doubted that Kronos would go out of his way to mention an offer that Hades would put forward if it wasn't the more important part of this conversation. "I watched as my kin destroyed this world in their pride and recklessness from my realm of souls. All of this was due to a failure of a ruler who refused to control these desires for the good of the world. At that time, I decided that should another hegemon achieve immortality and ideally divinity, I would give them an offer that may come as a surprise given its nature. Has my niece told you what we did with the essences of the Titans after we overthrew them?" Hades asked, and Nick nodded. "She likely told you that we imprisoned them in my realm, but she likely didn't say why we did this instead of outright killing them. The difference between them and us was that they were only one generation separated from the primordials born from the world itself, and as a result were tied to the domains intrinsically. Destroy their bodies or souls, and in time a new being would be born from the world unless a new being took over their domain. Knowing this, we were forced to trap their essence instead." Hades explained calmly. 618, Chapter 618. Despite the way my kin portrayed them, the Titans were good and fair wardens of the world that knew to maintain it. My offer is simply to offer them a second chance. While not even I can free them from their prison, I can still destroy their souls so that the world may spawn them anew. This decision lay entirely within your hands, but I will not rush you in this matter, as it is a weighty choice indeed." Hades said calmly, before falling apart into dust that scattered with the breeze. "Yeah, that tracks. How like Hades to drop a heavy decision like this on others' shoulders before bailing." Nick thought, amused. "Still, I should probably speak with my wife about this to get a second opinion on the Titans. The last thing I want is to unleash a bunch of powerful beings on the planet that go on a murderous rampage at the drop of a hat." He thought as well before going to find Hephaestus. He was not surprised to find her at work in the crafting room, forging a new Zampercuto. She smiled when she saw him and put down what she was doing to walk over and give him a kiss. "What brings you here, my love?" she asked curiously. Nick told her what Hades had said and why he had come to see her at this time. She seemed genuinely surprised by the offer and explained that while she was born after the first generation of guards escaped from Kronos' prison at that time, Hades seemed to hate the Titans just as much as the rest of them did. She did confirm, however, that even at the height of the war between the two sides, the Titans still took great care to avoid upsetting the balance of the world. That was even the reason why the guards won in the end, as they purposefully tried to unbalance the world, knowing that the Titans would try and fix it, leaving them vulnerable. It took far more power and time to repair something than it did to break it after all. Surprisingly, Hades had been the one to suggest imprisoning the Titans to begin with, after the first of them, slain, rose again a century later as a new being. That he was now the one seeking to release them was irony at its greatest. Nick did confirm that the new being born after the Titans were slain did not have the previous being's memories, however, which was a key piece of information. If they had their memories from before they were slain, then Nick wouldn't even consider releasing them, as mankind, and much of the world, was different and unnatural as compared to their version of the world. One had to remember that humanity was a product of the gods, and not something the world itself had spawned in time. To pure beings of the world at its most raw time, period, the Titans would undoubtedly seek to fix this unnatural aspect. Without their memories of what used to be, however, the new Titans would only see what is instead and would seek to preserve it. This would be a boon more than anything for Nick's rule after he added the world to his realm. The normal process of consuming a realm with another was to drag the new one into one's own realm, but Nick decided to do the opposite and bring his realm to the real world instead. Originally, he was going to follow tradition, but with the Titan's possible return, this would work even better. This also came with the added bonus of him slowly being able to expand his control away from Earth and out into the wider universe as he brought more and more space under his power. With this in mind, Nick went deep below the island to where the Leyline Nexus was and shattered the ring holding his realm from within. The world rumbled and shifted as the planet of the realm manifested into the real world and immediately latched onto the Leyline Nexus like a parasite. From there, it slowly began to expand its control of the surroundings, bringing more and more of the Earth under Nick's control, while no one was the wiser. The first part of the world to become a part of Nick's power was the island, and several miles in every direction from it. From there, it slowly converted everything at its edges at a constant but slow rate. The only one aware that he had done something was Hephaestus, as she could feel his power growing constantly, as his realm brought more and more of the earth under his control. 619. Chapter 619. The End. It took a century more or less for Nick to fully bring the world itself under his control. His reaching Tier 8 after assimilating half of Europe, 20 years after he began this slow process, only worked to accelerate it. His domains had evolved once again at that time into the space domain, and giving him near sole authority over one of the three foundational forces of the world. There were others who delved in the space domain, but Nick was the highest power in it, and was its embodiment, chaotic yet stable, destructive and yet creative. All aspects of what space was he had in spades, and so the domain came to him as naturally as breathing. Unlike what one would expect, Nick did not seek to make the world as advanced as possible, but rather he wanted it balanced. As a result, he had shaped his territory civilization to work with the natural order rather than to suppress it. Sustainable resource gathering practices, free-flowing water through the mega-city, and adaptive medicines that had a solution for most problems. In many ways, his territory could be said to be a paradise, as everything simply worked. The same, however, couldn't be said of the rest of the world, as greed and selfishness were deeply ingrained in humanity as a whole. Nick didn't suppress these other nations, as he understood that humanity did its best work when conflict and pressure were applied. This was why he had made a magical pact, using the power of every god on the planet, that no gods could interfere with matters that are of mortal making, unless it threatens the natural balance of the world itself. Not even a month after this pact had been made, war broke out, as the nations that had held themselves back for fear of divine retribution acted out. With war consuming the world again, no one noticed, as the world itself was fighting a losing battle as he forcefully assimilated it. That changed the day the world finally lost entirely, and Nick fully assimilated the world. It was no more than a ripple in truth, but every being above a certain tier felt it and knew its source. Nick was confronted about it, and he freely admitted that he was now the world, and the world was now a part of him. He was chastised, and demanded to reverse what he did, but he directly stated it was impossible. Once a realm is fully converted, there is no reversing it at that point. It belongs to the Daedra who bound it, which in this case was Nick, who stood at the pinnacle of Tier 8, and was vastly more powerful than any other being on the planet. Many thought that this meant that he was going to go full tyrant and micromanage every aspect of the world, but nothing changed at all. With this done, Nick was finally satisfied and fulfilled Hephaestus's long-held desire to have a child. The first of three he would have in total, Morathius the Wise. Morathius was born with black skin and small horns and sapphire blue slit eyes, but otherwise appeared elvish. The child was born with the wisdom and knowledge domains and was very much a bookworm after growing up. He spent nearly all of his time within his father's ever-expanding library to the point few ever got the chance to meet him. The second child, Saratha the Strong, was much less pleasant, as she had taken her father's Daedric and hollow traits almost entirely, and was simple-minded and battle-driven, but certainly not stupid by any means. She occupied the vast majority of her time with gathering warriors to compete in her war games for grand prizes she may or may not have succored her parents into giving her. As the only girl of the trio of siblings, Saratha was spoiled by her parents to some degree and rarely denied anything without good reason. Prometheus, the Starborn, was the youngest, but most exceptional of the children, as he alone was born a perfect combination of mother and father. He was born with golden skin, adorned with fine white feathers and hair that was silver and red atop his head. As a perfect mix of both his parents, he literally glowed with power and was skilled at crafting, war, and academics. He was also the only of his siblings to leave Earth and explore the wider universe, as he idolized his father's achievements and wanted to make a name for himself as well. Nick slowly extended his control past Earth after that, and eventually came across other worlds with guards of their own. The most powerful, however, was only Tier 9, which was also the highest quantifiable level of power, as after that things got blurry and had to track. Nick knew this, as by the time he came across, said Tier 9, he had assimilated almost a quarter of the galaxy, and simply willed them out of existence when they tried to attack him. So it was that his story came to its conclusion, as he eventually assimilated the entirety of the universe, and had nowhere else to go, and thus stopped. 620. After note, author. I am aware that this ending was kinda rushed, and all that, but you need to understand that by this point, I have come to accept that I fucked up the story. Yeah, it had its moments where everything just seemed to be going right for it, but my biggest mistake was the system. It would have been fine in, say, a multiversal type story, but for a single one like this, it got out of hand fast. By the time it came for Zeus to be killed, I realized that I was dragging out the inevitable. With that in mind, I just typed up the ending I would have ended up with at this rate, and called it a day. As an author, I've grown a lot since I've started so long ago. My grammar's improved, not perfect mind you, but improved. My storytelling has also greatly improved, as this was easily the longest story I have ever written to date, and despite its flaws, was still considered good by almost all of you who read to this point. You may be asking at this point if I might ever revisit the Harry Potter franchise. The answer is maybe. For now, I want to explore other things in my writing, and in the future may take a crack at a proper Harry Potter story without all the flaws of this one. With all of this said, I am currently working on 3 separate stories at this exact moment, one of which some of you should be familiar with. I am, of course, referring to A Random Pokémon Journey. It's a dark and semi-realistic take on the world of Pokémon. The MC is also not a pleasant person for a good portion of the story, but for the most part that is intentional. After that, I am currently writing Naruto, Secret Sage, as well. It's about a guy reborn into the Naruto world as a sage. It reads like a diary or narration, but that was intentional since I am testing that style out. The MC is up from the start, and only gets more so as time goes on, but doesn't show it all that often. I suppose the story can be considered slice of life to a degree. Finally, I am also writing Danmachi, Hell's Forge. The MC is kinda insane, but in a mostly positive way, and changes things in the world by just being there. The story also features pretty interesting crafting stuff fairly often after the MC gets his Falna, if that's your jam. If you are reading this from Royal Road, then unfortunately, you will only find my Pokemon story available since the site doesn't like fanfic writers having a Pat Rian. It wasn't a matter of selling copyrighted material either, as that's not what my Patreon is for, but simply the possibility of it. Anyways, my Patreon exists, so you guys can read ahead early and directly message me, or take part in any of the polls I put up there. I thank all of you for reading my story and wish you all a good life. Patreon Kamsi, Patreon Loskro /posts.